This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome to episode 49 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. For today's episode, we will be looking at key observations and trends from around the league in Week 14. But before we get started, I want to remind you, you can follow and interact with the show. We are on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. Now verified, we are at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show any questions at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now let's start with the New England Patriots, who got the win on Thursday Night Football in Pittsburgh. And I want to spotlight running back Ezekiel Elliott, because without Ramondre Stevenson in the lineup, Zeke Elliott played 52 out of 57 snaps. That was 91% snap rate. And more importantly, he had 30 total opportunities in that game. He had 22 carries. He had 8 targets. No other running back even stepped on the field. He was a true definition of a workhorse running back on Thursday night. Now, only 12 other instances this season has a running back had at least 30 opportunities in a game. On top of that, Zeke caught 7 of 8 targets for 72 yards and a touchdown, with another 68 rushing yards. By the way, the 8 targets was a team high. Zeke Elliott had a 31% target share. Zeke Elliott finished the week as running back 1 with 27 fantasy points. In the previous week, he was running back 15 when Stevenson left early in the Week 13 game with an ankle injury. Now, I'm not going to go crazy with my weekly ranking for Zeke. I'm not going to have him inside the top 10, but I think he should be ranked somewhere in the mid-teens. This is still a very pedestrian offense with limited touchdown volume as a team. However, his workhorse role and opportunity volume are more than enough to lock Zeke into your starting lineup as a running back 2 until Ramondre Stevenson returns. As a side note, with the wide receiver position, due to the injury attrition at that unit group, Patriots receiver Juju Smith-Schuster, he had a season-high 23% target share against Pittsburgh. That was second on the team after Zeke Elliott. He also scored a season-high 13 PPR fantasy points. Over the last 2 weeks, Colts running back Zach Moss has had this utilization. He has played 121 of 132 snaps. That's 92% snap rate. He had 32 of the 35 running back carries, 91% rush share. He had 63 routes run on 90 dropbacks from Gardner Minshew. That's a 70% route participation rate. He had 11 targets for a 14% target share. He had 9 carries inside the 10-yard line, but he had 0 touchdowns, and he has scored 14.3 fantasy points in total over that 2-game sample. Now, I know it is frustrating, but Zach Moss needs to remain in your starting lineups. His expected fantasy points based on his usage does not line up with his actual points over the last 2 weeks. I would expect positive regression for Zach Moss in the coming weeks. Now, in comparison to Zach Moss, a player like Buffalo's James Cook right now has limited usage or utilization, but he is producing elite fantasy production. On Sunday, James Cook had 10 carries for 58 yards. He had 5 receptions on 5 targets. He caught all of them, 83 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Now, James Cook's average targets per route run is 31% since Joe Brady took over as the offensive coordinator. Cook has 12 total targets in the last 2 games. He only had 1 game with at least 6 targets prior to Week 12, and that was the Bills' first game of the season. Now, Cook's role inside the 5-yard line, it remains non-existent, and he remains below a 50% snap rate, but the uptick in targets is what is propelling him into fantasy success. He is performing at running back 1 levels with Joe Brady as his offensive coordinator. The last 3 games, James Cook has finished as running back 10, 12, and then running back 4 on Sunday in weekly scoring. On Sunday, the Atlanta Falcons finally used all 3 of their elite skill position players and put them in a position for fantasy success. First, running back Bijan Robinson, he played over 77% of Atlanta's offensive snaps on Sunday. He has now finished as a running back 1 or inside the top 12 in weekly PPR scoring in 3 of his last 4 games. Wide receiver Drake London, he caught 10 of 11 targets for 172 yards receiving. This is only the second time this season that Drake London has had a double-digit target volume, leading to over at least 125 receiving yards. He did that in both games. Now, in those 2 games where London got at least 10 targets, he didn't score a touchdown in either, but he finished as wide receiver 6 and wide receiver 2 on the week in those instances. And every other week on the season, London has finished outside the top 20 in weekly scoring. And lastly, tight end Kyle Pitts, he saw his snap rate climb to a season-high 85% on Sunday. He had a season-high 41 routes run. His target per route run rate, it decreased sharply to less than 15%. He had 6 targets on 41 routes. However, his second touchdown on the season was enough to place Pitts as tight end 7 on the week, only the 3rd time this season that Kyle Pitts has finished inside the weekly top 10 at his position. Demarcus Robinson tied Cooper Kupp with a team-leading 10 targets on Sunday for the LA Rams. He also had a season-high 86% snap rate, and that was because Tutu Atwell left that game early due to a concussion. Now, Robinson only caught 3 of those 10 targets, but he scored a touchdown, which resulted in 13.6 fantasy points. Now, for Cooper Kupp, he had at least 10 targets and 100 receiving yards for only the 2nd time this season. His first was his Week 5 debut, and then he did it again on Sunday. Kupp scored 25.5 PPR points, by far his highest total since Week 6. Now, Week 6 and on Sunday are the only 2 weeks where Cooper Kupp has finished as a weekly top 10 wide receiver. Puka Nacua has still not finished a game this season with a target share below 20%. He had another 9 targets on Sunday, and in 13 games played this year, Nacua has finished inside the weekly top 20 in all but 4 of them. Now, those 3 players combined for a nearly 75% target share on Sunday for Los Angeles. That's Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, and Demarcus Robinson, almost a 75% target share. Kupp finished as wide receiver 4 on the week, Nacua was wide receiver 19, and Robinson was wide receiver 22. And rookie Davis Allen, he played 71% of snaps due to the injuries to Tyler Higbee, which is before the game, and then Hunter Long early in the game. But Davis Allen finished as tight end 6 on the week with 5 targets and a touchdown. And of course, running back Kyren Williams, he had another 29 total opportunities. He finished as running back 18 without a touchdown. And the catalyst for all of it, Matthew Stafford, has finished between quarterback 5 and quarterback 8 in weekly scoring for 3 straight weeks now. He has 10 total passing touchdowns over the last 3 weeks. His totals 4, 3, and 3. Now, do not sleep on the Rams as an elite resource for fantasy production right now. Similar to how the Texans were crushing it across all position groups last month, the Rams are healthy and are one of the best fantasy offenses for the last month of the season. Now, the best stack in fantasy football over the last month is Justin Fields and DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. Now, Justin Fields has 18, 12, and 12 rushing attempts in his last 3 games since returning from injury. And in the 5 full games that Justin Fields has played since Week 4, Fields has finished as a top 3 quarterback in weekly scoring in 3 of 5 and a top 10 in weekly scoring in 4 of 5. And DJ Moore continues to be one of the best fantasy wide receivers with Justin Fields at quarterback. You see, DJ Moore is averaging 21.3 PPR points per game with Fields this year and 9.8 without him. On Sunday, DJ Moore had 6 receptions, 68 yards, 1 touchdown. He also had 3 carries, 20 rushing yards, and another rushing touchdown. He had 26.8 fantasy points. He finished as wide receiver 3 on the week. And from week 3 on this year, DJ Moore has had over 30% target share with Justin Fields at quarterback in every single game. Over the last 3 weeks, Moore is averaging over 10 targets a game, almost 24 fantasy points. He's been above 22 fantasy points in each of those 3 games, and he finished as a weekly top 10 wide receiver in weekly scoring the last 3 weeks. Now, for the running back position, Deontay Foreman, he was back for Chicago on Sunday. He led the backfield with a 56% snap share. Roschon Johnson was at 27%. Khalil Herbert was only at 17%. I would stay away from this backfield right now, which is a full-on 3-headed committee. Coming into Sunday, there were reports that Chargers running back Austin Eckler was going to see his workload decrease, but that did not happen on Sunday. Eckler played 72% of the Chargers snaps, which is around his season average. He saw a 17% target share, which is slightly higher than his 15% rate on the season. His share of total opportunities, which is rushes plus targets, was 65% on Sunday, a little bit below his season average of 74%. However, there was nothing in his usage on Sunday to indicate a downgrade in his workload. In fact, with the injury to Justin Herbert, Eckler could see a bump in his usage and in particular his targets, which would be a plus for fantasy production. By the way, last week we talked about Eckler's yards per carry numbers trending downwards. He had an anemic 1.3 yards per carry in Week 13, but last week he bounced back. He averaged 5.1 yards per carry and 9.8 yards per target, which is some of the best that he has had this season. Eckler finished inside the top 10 in weekly scoring in Week 14 after being outside the top 30 the previous 3 weeks. Cincinnati's Chase Brown on Sunday had 8 carries for 25 yards, he had 3 receptions for 80 yards, and he had a receiving touchdown. Chase Brown played 30% of Cincinnati's snaps against the Colts, and he has now seen a 32% and 28% running back rush share over the last 2 games. And he was used more as a receiver on Sunday too, with a 12% target share. Now, no Cincinnati Bengal had more than 4 targets on Sunday, and that includes Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, who were both at 4 targets each. In fact, the wide receiver unit only had a 42% target share as a group. That is the lowest of the season by far. On the season, the wide receiver unit for Cincinnati has a 70% target share, and again, it was at 42% on Sunday. By comparison, the running back unit was well over their season average, which was at 12% target share to the running back group coming into Sunday, but on Sunday had a collective 33% target share. Now, furthermore, Jamar Chase has been outside the top 30 in weekly scoring in 3 of his last 4 games, and except for Week 13's 12 targets, Jamar Chase has been between 4 and 7 targets since Week 10. The Houston Texans were one of the better offenses for fantasy football through November, but has quickly been gutted by injury. C.J. Stroud left Week 14 with a concussion. He is uncertain for Week 15. Nico Collins got hurt in that game. He has a calf strain. He is going to be questionable for Week 15. The wide receiver group, without Nico Collins and, of course, without Tank Dell, the number of routes run by that group on Sunday was led by Robert Woods with 27 routes, Noah Brown with 26, and then rookie Xavier Hutchinson at 23. But the running back unit as well has been pretty confounding to figure out week to week. After watching his workload drop in Week 13, Devin Singletary saw a better one in Week 14. He had 68% of Houston's running back rushes. Last week he was at 33%, and we saw his snap share raise a little bit by about 11 percentage points. Now, given the injury situation across the board for the Houston Texans, Devin Singletary is the only player right now that I would even consider as a running back 2 or flex option for Week 15. After seeing a 29% target share in Week 13, Elijah Moore had a 14% target share on Sunday. Of course, Amari Cooper was back in the lineup. Amari Cooper had a 33% target share in that game. In addition, David Njoku has been below 20% target share in back-to-back games, even though he was above 20% target share in the previous 6 games from weeks 7 through 12. However, Njoku finished with 6 catches on 8 targets for 91 yards and 2 touchdowns. Njoku finished with 27.1 fantasy points. That's the best outing on the season, and it is the first game of the year where he was over 20 fantasy points. Njoku has finished as a top 10 tight end in weekly scoring in 4 of his last 5 games. As for the Jacksonville Jaguars, they had 3 different players receive at least 11 targets on Sunday, as the Jags were in a negative game script. They had 45 total targets to only 18 rushing attempts in that game. Zay Jones, he led the team with 14 targets, but he only caught 5 of them. By the way, Zay Jones had 7.9 fantasy points, which is by far the lowest number of fantasy points in a game with at least 14 targets for a wide receiver. The previous low this season was 11.7, but the average for wide receivers with at least 14 targets in a game this year was nearly 28 fantasy points. Calvin Ridley, he had 12 targets, but he only caught 4 of them. Ridley has 21 targets in the last 2 weeks, but has a sub 40% catch rate with no touchdowns. He's below 10 fantasy points in both of the last 2 weeks, even with the high target volume. But the breakout player, and quite frankly it's long overdue, is tight end Evan Engram. He had a season-high 12 targets, 95 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He had 32.5 fantasy points. Now, for much of the season, Engram has reliably gotten targets, but he's had no touchdowns through week 12. He was consistently in the tight end 5 to tight end 10 range in weekly scoring based on his consistent target volume. But the last 2 weeks, he's not only seen a slight uptick in targets, 21 in total over the last 2 weeks, but he has 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games. He has over 55 fantasy points in that 2-week sample, which is by far the tight end 1 in fantasy scoring. For the last 6 games, Patrick Mahomes has failed to break 300 passing yards and has failed to break 3 passing touchdowns in a game over his last 6. This is the longest streak of his career with fewer than 300 passing yards in a game, the longest streak in his career without 3+ passing touchdowns in a game. In just 2 games this year, Patrick Mahomes has had 3+ total touchdowns. Last year, he had 10. Patrick Mahomes has 8 passing touchdowns in his last 6 games. Unfortunately, and it's not on Mahomes, but more his supporting cast, but Mahomes might be the biggest bust in fantasy this year. He was drafted as the quarterback 1, a round ahead of both Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. But Mahomes is currently quarterback 8 in total points, but even worse, has not finished as a weekly top 10 quarterback in 5 of his last 6 games, and even the 1 game where he did, he finished as quarterback 8. Mahomes is only averaging 15.1 fantasy points since week 8. He averaged almost 10 more points per game last season. Now conversely, Bills quarterback Josh Allen scored a passing and rushing touchdown in week 14. It was the 9th game this year where he's had both a passing and rushing touchdown that ties an NFL record. Now, his rushing prowess gives Josh Allen an insulated floor for fantasy scoring every week. So much so that Allen has been in the top 10 of weekly scoring in all but 3 games this year and inside the top 15 in all but 1. And I'll credit Michael Florio on Twitter for this next stat, but since entering the league, Josh Allen has 34 games with a passing and rushing touchdown. No one else has more than 18 in that span. Josh Allen has finished as quarterback 1 in season points in 2020, 2021. He was quarterback 2 last season and is on pace to be quarterback 1 again this year. Lions receiver Amon-Ra St. Brown caught just 3 of 9 targets on Sunday for 21 yards. He's caught only 5 passes over his last two games, but he does have a target share in those games of 24% and 27%. And while these figures are still solid, it is a drop from a near 30% target share that he had on the season prior to 2 weeks ago. Now, prior to the last 2 weeks, Amon-Ra was averaging 11 targets per game with a catch rate of 75%. In the last 2 weeks, Amon-Ra is down to 7.5 targets per game with a catch rate of 33%. And then lastly, let's talk about the Chiefs running back situation with Isaiah Pacheco missing Sunday's game. Now, Jerick McKinnon, he played 28 snaps on Sunday compared to 30 for Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Now, McKinnon ran just 2 more routes than CEH, and McKinnon only had 7 total opportunities in that game, but he finished as running back 21 on the week due to catching all 3 targets and scoring a rushing touchdown. Now, I think McKinnon should be a fringe top 20 ranked running back while Pacheco remains out. By comparison, CEH, he had 15 total opportunities, which was 8 more than McKinnon, but he finished with 4 fewer fantasy points. So that'll wrap up episode 49 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. We'll be back with another episode on Thursday, looking at players you should not be afraid to start as we enter the playoffs. So for Dustin Chandry signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.